So good afternoon and welcome to the College of Arts and Letters Faculty Research Spotlight. We are so excited today to have three of our outstanding faculty members presenting their research. The scholarly projects that our faculty members are going to talk about today are projects for which they have received an award and or a grant. Our presenters, I'll just very briefly introduce them in alphabetical order, are Dr. Eric Behrens Garcia from Philosophy, Dr. Jessica Getman from the Department of Music, and Dr. Tom Girshin from the English Department. And our moderator today is Dr. Matthew Davidson, Professor of Philosophy. Well, I thank you all for being here, and Professor Davidson, the floor is yours.
So our first speaker, a giant picture of my face just showed up on my screen. Yeah. So our first speaker is Professor Eric Behrens Garcia. He's an assistant professor of philosophy at CSUSB. He specializes in philosophy of race, epistemology, social epistemology, and Latin American philosophy. In his work, he focuses on epistemological questions raised by racial justice in the U.S. and colonialism in the Americas. And his paper is called his presentation is called Afro-Latinx, Hispanic and Latinx Identity, Understanding the Americas.
Well, thank you, Paristu and Matt. I appreciate the introduction. I need to share my screen, so I think someone should enable that. Here we go. Thank you. Okay. Can everyone see that? Yep, great.
Yes. Yes.
Okay, I'm timing myself. I'll try to keep it to 15 minutes or less. Okay, so in this paper, I have a few things that I want to do. I may or may not do all of them, but one thing I want to do is intervene in this debate that's gone on in the philosophy literature in general, and the Latin American philosophy in particular, between folks who think the identity term Hispanic is the most appropriate term to refer to Hispanic or Latinx folks, and other folks who think, no, Latinx is the most appropriate term to refer to Hispanic or Latinx folks. So there's this debate going on, and I'm kind of intervening in this debate. And the way I'll intervene is by suggesting or arguing that neither of these is completely or adequate for reasons that have to do with understanding certain kinds of cases in certain parts of the Americas. I also want to motivate that the term Afro-Latinx, as apart from or distinct from Hispanic or Latinx itself, I want to motivate the idea that Afro-Latinx as an identity term yields subjects or individuals understanding of Hispanic or Latinx experience that the term Hispanic and the term Latinx themselves don't yield, right? And in epistemology, there's this distinction between knowing things and understanding things, and understanding tends to go along with having explanations. So the idea here is that the term Afro-Latinx, when people use it to describe or talk about Latinx experience in certain cases, allows people to explain this experience in power relations in a way that the term Hispanic or Latinx themselves don't, and thus these explanations result in people understanding the world as opposed to merely knowing the world. And the idea is like understanding is this more robust kind of state where you can explain things. When you know things, you can't necessarily explain them. And I think that the set of cases kind of that you can explain obtain both in the US and across the Americas more generally. So let me give you a sense of this debate that's gone on. There's been a debate over the aptness or the appropriateness of these identity terms, Hispanic on the one hand and Latinx on the other. And this debate has gone on where at first, at the outset of this debate, the debate was about Hispanic and Latinx understood as ethnic terms as opposed to racial terms, right? Where Hispanic or Latinx is referring to people who are similar ethnically or ethnic groups like the Irish, the Italian, and the Greeks, right? So Hispanic or Latinx might just be another kind of ethnic term. That's how this debate first got off the ground in the year 2000. Now, Jorge Gracia, the person who published a book that kind of got this on Latinx or Hispanic identity, who got this debate going, he thought the term Hispanic was more apt or is more apt than Latinx because it individuates its members, the people who kind of fall under this, the term Hispanic or Latinx, on the basis of what he calls a familial historical relation back to 1492. And the idea here is families can include its members on the basis of like family or genetic ties, of course, right? Parents have children and they're in the same family, but you can also adopt people and they become part of a family. So the idea here is that people who are Hispanic count as Hispanic because of how they relate through historical relations to what's called the encuentro between, or the encounter between Iberians, Spaniards and Portuguese, and indigenous persons here in the Americas, right? So another reason that I should also mention, this term includes folks like, well, I just mentioned it, Iberians and indigenous persons and all the other folks who we may think intuitively fall under the category of Hispanic, right? And because of this, Gracia says, oh, this term is politically inclusive as it allows us to pitch a big tent. So we can include the Iberians, we can include indigenous peoples and people who speak various languages, Nahuatl, Mixtec, Spanish, Portuguese, whatever, right? And that's good for political reasons. So really there are kind of two reasons here. Hispanic is good for reasons that have to do with accurately representing the world, right? And accurate representation depends on relating back to 1492, and it's politically inclusive. Now, Linda Martin Alcoff has argued against this, that Latinx, the identity term, is more apt because it individuates its members, right? Someone counts as, it picks out people who relate to 1898. That's the more relevant date. And that's when colonialism by her lights gets up and on its feet, right, in the Spanish-American War. And then the folks who count as Latinx on this basis are folks like Puerto Rican folks, Mexican folks, where Iberians will be excluded, right? And one reason for that is that Iberians don't tend to suffer Latinx oppression, right? Spanish and Portuguese, in the same way that Puerto Rican or Mexican folks do. So that seems like a good reason to exclude them because they're not suffering or experience something that we associate with being Latinx, which is anti-Latinx racism, right? So the debate shifts from a debate about these terms understood as ethnic terms to a debate about whether Latinx identity or Hispanic identity is properly understood as a race, or whether it involves racial components, not merely ethnic components, right? So Gracia and J. Angelo Corlett have argued that Hispanic or Latinx identity is properly understood as an ethnicity because there are just too many disparate phenotypes that intuitively fall under the, or seem to fall under the category of Hispanic or Latinx to think of it as a race, where race seems to go along with phenotypical or visible features that are similar across a group, right? So Iberians or Argentinian descendant, German or Italian descendant Argentinians or Paraguayans, right? They're gonna kind of not comport phenotypically with, say, people who are indigenous or of more African descent, say. And that's a reason to think that Latinx is really an ethnicity, not a race. Alcoff has argued, well, this is really more, if you want to understand why Latinx folks have not assimilated the same rates as other ethnic groups, such as the Irish and the Italians and the Greeks, then you have to understand Latinx as involving a racial component in addition to an ethnic component, because that the anti-Latino racism or Latinx racism that Latinx folks face is going to be in virtue of some kind of phenotypes or racism that has to do with phenotype. So therefore, if you want to understand the difference between Irish and Latinx assimilation and social mobility, you need to understand Latinx identity as involving at least some kind of racial component. And other folks have presented other views. I won't even get into those because I'm taking too long. So what's my basic argument here? So the basic argument, the first premise in my basic argument is that Afro-Latinx identity yields subjects or individuals who use this term understanding of certain events, of how certain events depend on anti-Black racism, the US's racially unjust structure, and US colonialism, right? So a second premise in my argument is that neither the term Hispanic nor the term Latinx yield this similar kind of understanding. And I'm going to give you a sense of the cases that Afro-Latinx yields understanding of. But I think I can conclude that the term Afro-Latinx yields understanding of these events that Hispanic and Latinx do not. And I can conclude even more so that the identity term Afro-Latinx is more apt than Hispanic or Latinx. And I'll motivate this in a moment, and in a significant number of cases. Here, I'm making an assumption in this argument, and the assumption is that if one term, say Afro-Latinx, yields more understanding than, or a desideratum, something that's good about using one term over another, is going to be if it yields more understanding. So if Afro-Latinx yields more understanding, then that's a good reason to favor one term over the other, okay? So I'm also assuming that we're talking about US subjects here, doing the understanding of both the US and the Americas. And I'll kind of move more quickly now. So to give you a sense of how race terms relate to understanding, take the, I'll give you two descriptions of a case. Suppose some adult men bomb a church and 4 young girls were killed. That's one description of a case. But suppose I tell you that 4 white men through bombing a church killed 4 Black young girls. You might have a better sense of what kind of event transpired. And here I'm talking about the 16th Street Baptist church bombing in the 60s in Birmingham, Alabama, right? So race terms yield understanding. And why do we continue to use race terms? Black, white, indigenous, and so on. We use them because they help us explain the world, right? Those terms help us get a sense or a grip of what's going on out there. If we didn't use them, we wouldn't have that kind of understanding, right? That's the idea. But the kind of case I'm talking about here is, well, let me give you one case. So there was the Washington Heights uprising. So in 1993, NYPD officer O'Keefe murdered Afro-Latinx Dominican person Jose Kiko Garcia, and he was unarmed, many say, when he was killed or murdered. And as a result, you had 9 days of protests, building fires, 121 burned vehicles, 139 arrests, 90 injuries, and a further death, which was very suspicious and at the hands of police. So this is what people now call the Washington Heights uprising. It actually happened just before the LA protests or riots or what have you, okay? And to give you a sense of kind of like what was going on at the time, Rudolph Giuliani was running against David Dinkins to become mayor for the first time. And he really evoked fears about Dominican folks as being kind of like innately criminal and needing to be controlled in defeating the first Black mayor of New York City, right? So here we have something that needs explaining. This is just a kind of fancy term that has to do with picking out what you want to explain, which is the Washington Heights uprising and Kiko Garcia's murder. And I think one thing, a basic point I want to make is that the term Afro-Latinx, when you use it, as opposed to Latinx or Hispanic, will evoke the right kind of content and histories and people such that you can explain these two events, these two things, the murder and the uprising's intensity, better, right? It will yield a better explanation and thus more understanding than Latinx or Hispanic. So to give you a sense of how this goes, the term Hispanic leaves unspecified Kiko Garcia's racial features that played a role, presumably, in why Officer O'Keefe murdered him, right? Had he been a white guy in non-Washington Heights, which is a Dominican neighborhood, probably wouldn't have been murdered. That's the idea. But why does Hispanic leave unspecified Kiko's racial features? Well, because it includes Iberians and Argentinians of recent European extraction and so on. And had Kiko Garcia had those features, the features that tend to co-vary with those folks, then he may have not been murdered. It's unlikely he would have been murdered. Hispanic does invoke xenophobia and ethnocentrism, no doubt, but it doesn't invoke some of the main explanatory facts, that is Kiko Garcia's racial and phenotypical features, right? It also leaves unaddressed, that is Hispanic does, anti-Black attitudes and how those attitudes played a role in the action and the murder of Kiko Garcia, right? Now, the term Latinx fares a bit better, I'd say, right? Because it excludes Iberians, but it doesn't really exclude Argentinians of white extraction or Costa Ricans of white extraction, or just a whole class of Latin Americans who are called the Criollo class. So the kind of like people who just go through their genealogy straight back without any other routes to Spain, right? That's the idea. And thus they tend to be more light-skinned. So Latinx does do a little better, but not all the way. So therefore, an idea here is that individuals not of African descent are included in the term Latinx. And this has the same problem that Hispanic does in terms of trying to explain this event in terms of what actually motivated, say, Kiko Garcia. So Afro-Latinx itself does invoke African descent and African Black attitudes, and it also invokes the history of US colonialism and explaining why Kiko Garcia left the Dominican Republic, right? Colonialism, actions in the Dominican Republic, occupation, and holding up dictators and authoritarians who were anti-Black themselves, right? And there's a long history of that. But I have run out of time, folks, so I will leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. Perhaps in Q&A, you can say a bit more of what you were intending to say. So our second speaker is Thomas Girshin. He's Associate Professor of English and Director of the Writing Intensive Program. His research focuses on composition pedagogy, writing program administration and assessment, and the rhetoric of exile. His research is heavily influenced by his status and experiences as a first-generation American, the child of Soviet refugees. His presentation is called Invention and Public Memory in the Letters of Gulag Prisoners.
Thank you for that, Matt. Thank you also, Paris, for introducing the event, and to College of Arts and Letters for hosting the event, and also for the mini grant that supported the research. And thank you to all of you for coming. Actually, I changed the title a little bit from when I submitted it. I added a prefix to the title that Matt just shared with you all, Such a Self I Cannot Live With, which I'll get to in the presentation. But my project is to analyze the rhetorical strategies writers imprisoned in the Soviet Gulag, particularly under Stalin, used in their letters in response to censorship. And I sort of struggled with how to contextualize this, because there's not really a clear narration about how these letters should be understood and how the Gulag should be remembered, either in Russia or even in the West. I think there's not as clear a narrative about the Gulag as there is, for example, about the Shoah or the Holocaust. And so part of the reason for this is that public memory has long been, public memory in Russia has long, in general, has long been fraught with pressures on both what to remember and what to forget. My sort of working definition of public memory is social action of bringing the past into deliberative spaces of the present. In totalitarian regimes, this deliberative aspect of public memory means that memory is subversive. It creates counter narratives. It's dangerous. As Victor Villanueva puts it, memory challenges the dominant hegemony. Viet Thanh Nguyen similarly writes, we forget because powerful interests often actively suppress memory, creating what Milan Kundera calls the desert of organized forgetting. At the same time, power is clearly interested in remembering as well, and we can see that in this photo, in both of these photos, one of which, the larger one represents a recent celebration of Victory Day in Russia, and the inset is one of the first Victory Day parades in Moscow. And Nguyen recognizes this, that rather than one being on the side of remembering and the other being on the side of forgetting, we actually have competing narratives of remembering and forgetting, because these narratives always include both. And I think we can see how this is operating today in the Russian war in Ukraine, right? It's Putin's ability to represent, to remember the past, or to narrate it in a certain way, as is reflected in this photo, that allows the attack on Ukraine to enjoy something like 80% support in Russia. And so clearly, contemporary Russia has yet to come to terms with its past. There was never anything in Russia or in the Soviet Union, anything like the Nuremberg trials after the Shoah in Western Europe, or the Truth and Reconciliation hearings in South Africa. There are official and unofficial days of remembrance and official and unofficial memorials, but these have not added up to a clear narrative about the past, at least in part because there has yet to be full transparency. So for example, the archives about the height of the repressions, the 1937, 1939 Great Terror archives, are still secret, are still hidden. And also in part because political repression in Russia is still very much ongoing thing, right? It's still very much part of contemporary Russia. The other sort of context here is the economic crises of the 1990s, when democracy, the question of democracy, and also the question of the legacy of the Soviet past really was brought to the fore of public deliberation. Really was also not completely settled. And so instead of sort of settling the matter, the 1990s acts as a sort of prison through which the past atrocities are narrated as either warranted or not. Khlyevnik, in her article Silencing or Magnifying Memories, writes about some of the Gulag mega projects, like the White Sea Canal, for example, and articulates the way that the narrations of the 1990s in museums justify views of Gulag prisoners as either victims on the one hand or martyrs on the other hand. And that dichotomy between victim and martyr is important for thinking about power and agency in how Gulag prisoners are constructed as subjects. In other words, what does that subject position mean? And that's something I'll But my point here is that how Russians view Stalin's repressions, to take the greatest example, is not at all settled, with perhaps as many seeking to rehabilitate their Soviet past as to condemn it. And this needs to be understood in the historical context of that the Gulag was always committed to its own historical erasure through forced amnesia. And the idea of forced amnesia is that everybody recognized it was going on. Everybody knew about it. It was, this was something that affected everybody in one way or another, but you didn't talk about it, right? So even though you knew it existed, you didn't talk about it. And we can see that actually echoing today as well, where the war in Ukraine is something that is known but not talked about. So given this powerful effort to erase, how do we look at archives like the archives of letters that I'm interested in, and the letters themselves? How do they help us to I'm borrowing from Zizek's Looking Awry here, how do they help us to integrate the trauma of their death into our historical memory? The letters represent a vast trove of evidence for how people may use rhetoric, especially coded language, to combat forced silence or erasure from public memory, and to reclaim their humanity. And here I agree with Gerard Hauser, who argues that those imprisoned in the Gulag drew on vernacular rhetorical strategies to assert their humanity in the face of a dehumanizing regime. And I argue that the vernacular aspect of the letters is very important because it shows the power of the everyday in maintaining a sense of human dignity against the dehumanizing strategies used at both the system and local levels. At a larger level, the letters also play a role in how the Soviet past may be remembered. Archives such as those that form from these letters are, quote, public alternatives to official constructions of the past and ways in which that past is to be studied. That's from Kalinina's Affordances of Digital Archives. So what are the archives? I'm drawing from the Remembrances of the Gulag archive at the Sakharov Center. This is an online archive of transcribed diaries, memoirs, and letters. These are in transcribed but not translated. The Hoover Institution also has an archive, and people have translated and published letters from there. And same thing with personal collections that have either been published in the original Russian or translated and published. So what do we see then in these letters? First, I know we didn't start right. I don't think I started right at 12:15, right? So what should I be my end time?
I think, Matt, were you keeping track? I think you started at 12:19 or so. Is that right, Matt?
Okay.
Yes. So maybe like 5 more minutes. Does that?
I can do that. Yeah.
5, 6. Okay.
So so what do we see in these letters that can help us kind of respond to that question of how do we integrate the trauma in those letters into our historical memory? The kind of I'm missing a slide here. Yeah, I'm missing a slide, but that's okay. I'll skip that slide and say that there are sort of two themes that I'm noticing in the letters. One has to do with survival. You see a lot of references to food, and so this is from a letter of Arsenii Farmakov. He talks about how he celebrated his son's 10th birthday, and there's this description of all the food that he ate and prepared, and that's common across the letters. Also, you also see direct requests for food, as in this letter here, and in these excerpts here. Oh, okay, here we go. I lost my place. And what's interesting is that the camp system not only allowed parcels, but actually encouraged parcels. This was an acknowledgement that there simply wasn't enough food, wasn't enough supplies to make the camp system work. And so they encouraged bringing in of parcels from outside to help the imprisoned people survive. And again, this suggests that the camps were not purely extermination camps, as in the Shoah, right? That they had, there was a meaning, an alternative meaning or purpose to that. And then the second theme is on the level of meaning. Here is from another letter from Malikov. He's in exile in Kazakhstan, and he's writing back to his family, and he says, it makes you think, what are people dying for? Mother could have lived so much longer, but she died for nothing. And so the same fate awaits us, same as mothers. If we don't escape from here, then we have to dig our own graves. How tired I am of being here in captivity, bound by my hands and feet, and how much I want to be free when life itself demands to be lived, and here every minute one waits for death. The sort of official Soviet narrative, the official Soviet meaning of these camps could be put into two categories. One was progress. This was about sort of modernizing the Soviet economy, right? And large projects like the White Sea Canal, for example, that you see in the background, were seen as a testing ground for using forced labor for large infrastructure projects. And then the other one is cleansing, sort of cleansing of the body politic. And so you have Lenin quoted here in Solzhenitsyn, lock up all the doubtful ones. The letters, on the other hand, show attempts to make meaning in opposition to, or at least outside of this. You have references, a lot of references to nature. You have also lots of references to relationships, as you see in this example here. And then also to a desire for political rehabilitation. In this example, it's sort of through official channels, but in lots of other examples, you see sort of alternative channels of political rehabilitation being constructed. And so these two things, the survival and sort of making alternative meanings of the experiences, I think are two of the most obvious contributions of the Gulag letters to the public memory of the Gulag. Both together are resistance efforts that seek to actually change the relationship, reconstitute the relationship of the state to the mind and body, to the body and mind, to keep the pattern I had before, of the prisoners, to reclaim that autonomy, and to doing that through that vernacular language, right? Through the sort of just the continual everyday lived action and language, to sort of reclaim the autonomy of the self, and to create a community in opposition to the way the state constructs them as a subject. And you actually, I think, see in that some of the beginnings of the overall move to establishing the political prisoner as a subject position in the Soviet Union. I think that's probably more than my time. So thank you very much.
you.
Our third speaker is Jessica Getman. She is a film musicologist with an emphasis in television studies and science fiction media. She works particularly on music and social discourse in the original series Star Trek. And she's going to speak on, or her presentation is called Star Trek, Sound, and Second Wave Feminism.
Thank you so much, Matt. So I would like to, actually, I need to reshare this. I realized I made a mistake. Cannot forget to share sound. All right. So I would like to sincerely thank the university and the College of Arts and Letters for the summer fellowship grant that I received. My goal was to complete a book proposal and 2 representative chapters for submission to the publisher, Oxford University Press, based on an extension of my dissertation, which was on music and social politics in the original series of Star Trek. So I was also able to use this grant to engage in archival work at Brigham Young University, filling out my collection of sources drawn from the Fred Steiner archives in their special collections. And in particular, I was able to get digital copies of 12 hours of interviews that Fred Steiner held with the composers, producers, and sound personnel of Star Trek. So that was a gold mine. So I was very happy about that. So in updating one of my chapters, I expanded my research on the oral representation of gender in the original series of Star Trek to explore more deeply how the show not only participated in an oral male gaze, which is pretty obvious to our 21st century ears, and I had addressed this in the dissertation through the scoring of episodes like Mudd's Women and characters like Vina in the original pilot episode. But I wanted to expand the work to dig a little bit deeper into how Star Trek was grappling a little bit more deeply with, and honestly, with mid-20th century feminist issues. So this research that I'm presenting right now is doing that by focusing on 2 characters, Number 1 and Lieutenant Uhura. So as with its stances on class, race, and international politics, Star Trek's views on gender and gender roles are complex. It's socially progressive in many ways, but also reliant on traditionalism and patriarchal bias. As a series that dispensed social commentary in the late 1960s, Star Trek did not avoid the issues of women's rights coming into public debate at the time. Marriage, economic freedom, workplace roles, sexuality, childbearing, beauty standards, and the complexities of female desire were addressed in a number of ways, sometimes in accord with the various avenues of feminist thought at the time, and sometimes against them. Many women who visited or served on the show's spaceship, which was its main set, the pseudo-military ship, the USS Enterprise, these women achieved a sort of economic and personal freedom, but their positions remained safely within the bounds of socially acceptable women's careers. The women stationed aboard the Enterprise served as nurses, executive assistants, communications personnel, and such roles were considered acceptable at the time for women in the professional world and for women in the military. The series sometimes allowed female guest characters a larger degree of self-determination, and they worked as diplomats, as with Nancy Hedford, intellectuals, as with Dr. Miranda Jones, and ship commanders, so the unnamed Romulan commander. Though the fact that they were highly capable in these roles of authority ultimately became, within their given episodes, secondary to their emotional dependency and need for romantic companionship. This research explores the rupture of second wave feminism in the 1960s between the progressive and the traditional through the musical or non-musical treatment of 2 of the series' most accomplished and assertive women. Number 1, who was the series' original second in command, portrayed by Majel Barrett, and Lieutenant Uhura, who was the Enterprise's communications officer, brought to life by Nichelle Nichols. The series addresses additional feminist issues beyond the economic and workplace autonomy. But even when progressive regarding other women's rights concerns, such as beauty and body standards, marriage roles, and behavioral expectations, it tends to err conservatively. Star Trek thrusts women into traditional roles following long-standing generic tropes, the damsel in distress, the femme fatale, the caregiver, the sacrificed woman, and the good wife or the good girlfriend. Still, while Star Trek fairly consistently made women the object of the male gaze, it also addressed an important tension in the second wave feminist agenda of the 1960s, which was the tension women felt between building a family and pursuing a career. This anxiety was identified by, for instance, Betty Friedan in 1963, who concluded The Feminine Mystique with multiple examples of women who identified a need for and pursued a professional identity beyond housewife and mother. These women had to fight for a balance between the two. Star Trek's narratives address this tension in various ways. And other scholars have noticed this as well. So Mary Jo Deegan in 1989 observed that women in Star Trek were often thrust into one of two narrative roles, either providing romance or illustrating women's abnormal desire for power. In 1994, Mary Henderson went further to note that Star Trek actually highlighted the struggle women felt to balance these two desires, the pull towards agency and relevancy in the professional world, and the pull towards romantic and familial fulfillment. The stories Star Trek told about women like Dr. Miranda Jones, Commissioner Nancy Hedford, and even Dr. Janice Lester very specifically address this tension between career and romance. And so did the character number 1 from the series' first pilot, The Cage. So Star Trek's original pilot, The Cage, was produced in 1964 and 1965. And its casting and its plot explored the progressive ideals that Roddenberry hoped to imbue into the show. In the case of women's rights, it did this to a greater degree than the rest of the series did. So they started out strong with women's rights. The original crew of the Enterprise featured a female officer, second in command. Number 1 commanded the ship's crew when the captain was unavailable. And the original Star Trek guide, which was written for use by the series creative team by Roddenberry, he described her as almost mysteriously female, slim and dark in a Nile Valley way, age uncertain, one of those women who will always look the same between years 20 and 50. An extraordinarily efficient space officer, number 1 enjoys playing it expressionless and cool, is probably Robert April, or the doctor's superior, in detailed knowledge of the equipment, departments, and personnel aboard this ship. So uncommonly pretty, uncommonly smart. She had to be both. The episode emphasized number 1's professionalism. Her colleagues referred to her as sir and not ma'am. She definitely led a planning session with the ship's top brass to free the captain from captivity. She even led the rescue team herself. The underscore affirmed her detachment from romance. Nowhere in the episode was she given a musical underscore. While Vina, who was the female romantic lead in this episode, she received multiple forms of scoring that labeled her as the good wife, the temptress, or the damsel in distress. And even Captain Pike, who was the main male character, his story was underscored with heroic adventure and danger tropes. Number 1 received nothing. This lack of music, or the lack of the signifier of female excess that has been associated with women on the screen, this might be seen as a progressive move on the part of the series composer or producers. And this is not to say that her womanhood was left devoid of relational and romantic prospects. Early on, Captain Pike seemed to forget that she was a woman at all. But later in the episode, she was described as a woman with, quote, a superior mind and who would produce highly intelligent children. Although she seems to lack emotion, this is largely a pretense. She has often had fantasies involving the captain, end quote. While this might feel to us like in the 21st century, like retrenchment, Star Trek was also responding to the 60s feminist tension between family and career. Number one, embodied the anxiety assumed by career women at the time, or many career women at the time, that in leadership, a woman could be as serious, efficient, and effective as a male, but in doing so, she might have to give up her womanhood, her emotions, relationships, and her chances at romance and family. However, this tension was fraught at the time, and test audiences and network executives weren't ready to acknowledge Star Trek's position on the issue. They found number one difficult to accept. They were uncomfortable with a woman holding an important leadership position on a military ship, even though Star Trek says it's not military, but it's a military ship. And they resented that as a character, she would try. So, and Roddenberry listened, and number one was canned from the show. In Star Trek's second pilot, the successful pilot, which aired in 1966, number one's personality, role, and rank was subsumed by the Spock character. And thereafter, female crew members in Star Trek played a more marginal role. Roddenberry's earlier commentary on number one's looks and mystique, describing her as slim and dark in the Nile Valley way, became the show's broader approach to women, focusing on their looks and romantic potential. Although the showrunners' more progressive feminist ideas still found their way, they kind of snuck their way into the narrative in different ways. Perhaps this determination to romanticize and subsume women, even as they were shown as professionally equal to their male counterpoints, was a reflection of Roddenberry's personal form of feminism. He encouraged women to rise up in the ranks of Hollywood. So DC Fontana, for instance, wrote several of the series scripts and served as the series story editor. But Roddenberry was also an agent of sex-positive feminism, which was a constructive stance in many ways, except that he also tended to relate to the women in his life as sex objects. So perhaps Star Trek's progressive stance on women in the workplace was undermined a little bit because of this, though also it could have been a careful effort to present a liberal perspective without offending members of an ideologically diverse audience. In any case, Star Trek, after the original pilot, turned to marking women as romantic trophies for the male crew, while simultaneously challenging the media traditions that made them mere objects for male character growth. And to be sure, Nichelle Nichols' role as Lieutenant Uhura in Star Trek was hardly equal. She was sexualized and marginalized as a Black female officer. Her character, however, facilitated a number of firsts along the path to racial equity in television, including what is widely regarded as the first interracial kiss. Although in this first racial kiss, her character was forced into the embrace against her will, so that's problematic. Her inclusion as a core member of the crew was a means to both feminist and racial progress, even noted by Martin Luther King Jr. Where was I? And the series' musical treatment of her emphasized the novelty of a capable Black female officer on the bridge of a mostly white military vessel. Her agency and her voice were highlighted through her diegetic or on-screen musical performances of two songs throughout the series. One was in the first season, Oh on the Starship Enterprise, and the second was Beyond Antares. So I'll just play a few seconds of Beyond Antares. And unfortunately, I only have the oral example. Could not grab the video.
And let the years go fading where my heart is, where my heart is, where my love eternally is waiting.
So Uhura's musicality, improvised and drawing on the trope of African-American music making, accentuates both her Blackness and her femininity, while perhaps more importantly, adding depth to a character who might otherwise have been assigned merely romantic narratives. Star Trek actually rarely used her as a romantic interest. Could have been for a variety of reasons, but she was firmly depicted as a trusted and capable command division bridge officer who rarely lost her cool and who could actually do more than run the communications array, which was her primary position. Her hobby of singing and playing music, like Kirk's interest in American history and Sulu's passion for botany and fencing, provided character development for her, and more character development for her than received by most of the rest of the cast. Now, to be clear, Uhura was placed in romantic positions, but those were notably forced, as in the kiss between herself and Kirk. Unlike Nurse Christine Chapel, whose romantic feelings for Spock were foregrounded throughout the series, and unlike female guest characters like Hedford and Jones, whose narratives included at least some romantic pull, Uhura remained relatively romance-free. Scenes in which she starred, therefore, were not scored for romance, but for the narrative's drama, action, danger, comedy. And so she was, in this way, treated, besides her on-screen musical performances, in terms of the underscore, she was treated much like number one, marked as a woman through dialogue and narrative, but in a move that bolstered her professional image, not marked as a woman or as a female romantic interest by the underscore. So in testing the blurred landscape between the progressive and the traditional by identifying its women as romantic interests at the same time as supporting their feminist identities, Star Trek not only catered to the varying ideologies of a broad demographic, but also tapped into the tensions of the time. Did women have to choose between being a wife or pursuing a successful career? If they wanted both, how could they balance the two in a socially acceptable manner? Star Trek addressed this by eventually placing its female crew in positions of responsibility, but not leadership. And while the number one character was quickly cut, Uhura, who was a more musical and relational character, was a fan favorite. While the romantic and sexual appeal of the many women who starred on Star Trek's screen certainly made the series easier to sell to an audience not yet ready for number one, the presence of these accomplished characters on television as officers, scientists, and politicians inspired a generation of women to pursue such careers in real life. The end.
Thank you, Jessica. I think we have time for a question or two. If you use the raise hand function, I'll call on you and try to keep your questions brief and say to whom you're asking the question. Thank you. Let's see. I see David Carlson's hand up.
I guess question for Eric, actually. Eric, I'm wondering, I'm thinking about the Kiko Garcia example you were using, and I'm wondering, this maybe give you a chance to further elaborate on some of your argument. Why would Dominican not be a term that would produce more understanding in describing him than Afro-Latinx?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there's an experience that Afro-Latinx people, largely from the Caribbean, but not only, share in a place like Upper Manhattan, specifically Washington Heights. So Afro-Cuban, Afro-Puerto Ricans. So there's a history of certain treatment. And then not all Dominicans are Afro-Dominican. That is like, although most are, not all are. And across that, there's a variation in degrees of African descent, which kind of causes a large degree of variation in phenotype in the Dominican Republic. So, but to put a point on the answer, Afro-Latinx, I think, picks out certain kinds of treatment that Afro-Caribbean people from the Spanish-speaking part of the Caribbean receive in a place like Washington Heights, and it also invokes a certain kind of US colonialism that you got in the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico and so on, that explained why Kiko Garcia was in the situation he was in.
And I think we have time for one more question. Charles has his hand up. Charles,
you're muted.
Yeah, we're not hearing you or seeing you. We just see your hand.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry. It wasn't just I was muted. There was all kinds of other things going on. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. Thank you so much. These are so great. I had no intention of saying anything today. I just wanted to visit, but I just can't help myself. I have to ask something, and I think it's directed to it's for everybody. As I think about light-skinned people crossing the border, and this is the Ukrainian comment, and this is darker skinned people at the border and lighter skinned people at the border. And then I can't help but to think about the light skin of your Uru, light skin and very straight hair. And I know that fits in with the idea to appeal, to have a broader appeal, but she's a lighter skinned Black woman and she has very straight hair. I just can't help but to think about skin tones crossing at the borders, Ukrainians crossing at the border, and all those things. So that's for everybody. Thank you. Great, Joey Grow. It was very enlightening presentations. Thank you.
Do any of our three speakers have anything to say in response to Rod's comment?
I can just say quickly, as far as Ukrainians at the border, I think you're right to point out that the way that we're responding to the war in Ukraine is very different than we've been responding to other refugee crises and even other ongoing wars. So I think there's definitely something to that point for sure.
And I mean, certainly, yeah, there's a point to the fact that Nichelle Nichols was presenting herself as assimilated, right, in a certain way, and that that kind of goes for her character throughout. But also, yeah, I could get into all of that, but it's not a lot of time. But it's a really interesting observation.
Well, thank you everybody for coming. People have to go teach now at 1. So we appreciate your being here, and thank you in particular to our 3 presenters, 2 of whom have taken off to teach.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.